Channel 5 Network. This is MorningLine with Nick Beres.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine on this Monday, which also happens to be Halloween. Not wearing a costume this morning, but we did have a Halloween party in the newsroom before this, and I ate a lot of candy, so I'm wired. And it's perfect for today's show. We're going to be talking about something you may or may not be aware of, a show, a podcast, dealing with true crime. And I know many of you have a fascination and interest in true crime because we do a lot of gavel-to-gavel trials. You know me. In the newsroom, one of my beats, of course, is some of these very high-profile criminal cases. But true crime is something that so many people have a very deep interest in. And sometimes delving into these cases, I think, is something that's there for folks, so many facts and details. We're going to talk about it this morning with... just love it. They're the brothers, sisters, but now they have different names because one of them is married. But they have a podcast you may have heard about, Killer Queens Podcast, and they're joining us here this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
I love it, the brothers, sisters. Okay, you're the brothers, sisters, but it's Tyrella Slemp now, correct?
Correct.
And now this is Tori Brothers, and you're sisters.
Yes, we are.
Thank you both for coming on.
Thank you.
Talking about the Killer Queens Podcast, over 50,000 listeners each episode. 13 million downloads. This is big time.
We're at 14.6 million now.
Wow. More than 500 cases, and I was scrolling through many of them, and we're going to talk about some of the cases, but maybe just let's get things started with you. How long have you been doing this podcast? Maybe first, what grabbed your attention to do a true crime podcast, and how did it start and evolve to the point where it is now? Because you told me before the show, it wasn't like, oh, we're going to go into this and it's just going to take off. And now you both make a living doing this with very popular, you do a terrific job. You've got to check out their podcast.
Thank you.
But how did you get an interest?
Our father,
yes,
has always been into true crime shows. Like ID Channel was always on, and so we would always watch it with him. And then to start the podcast, the sister dynamic came into play a little bit because I'm the older sister, and I got
bossy.
And I'm bossy, yeah. So I got really into marketing podcasts for a job that I was doing, and I had a friend say, well, they have true crime ones, and I was driving, commuting a lot to work or whatever, so I wasn't able to watch as many true crime shows.
Right.
And I was like, are you serious? I can listen to that in the car. She's like, yeah. So I started listening to it, and I'm like, Tori, we could do this.
Because it's kind of the same thing. You would sit around a table with your dad and talk about, but you both had a real interest in, what is it that grabbed you, the true crime, the mystery, the intrigue behind some of these cases?
Well, we have different things that we find interesting about true crime. I am very interested and intrigued by the psychology behind it. I like to know who committed the crime and why, if we could ever figure that out or know.
That's a good point. You don't, oftentimes, the motive doesn't really matter if the crime occurred, but I always wonder the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
She likes unsolved cases, which I understand the importance of them, but they drive me crazy. I need the closure.
Yeah.
And I don't.
Yeah, I like the investigation part of it and kind of putting the pieces together and the puzzle side of things. And
now the podcast, each individual one goes for over an hour. When you choose a show, a lot of research has to go into it because you're talking about it, but to grab anyone's attention, you have to show what you're talking about. And if you've listened, you guys are very personable and have, I think a really good conversation, but how much research do you put into each one of these episodes?
When we first started, because we were like, oh well, we're gonna watch stuff anyway, and we're gonna talk about a case anyway. So my initial thought was, well, we'll just do what we do anyway. We'll talk. I won't even have to edit it. We'll just watch something and talk off the cuff. And then we started, and I was like, well, I need to write stuff down. And so the first case that we did, I think it took 20 hours of research. I'm poring over things and trying to make a very detailed timeline, and then we talked, and then I thought, well, now I gotta learn how to edit, and then that took a long time. So it's many, a full-time work week per case.
And sometimes. What you're doing, you both are very busy doing these podcasts. You said, again, 4 years or so you've been doing it?
5 years.
5 years. And when it started simply enough, and you get your podcast, get going. What is it? Was there a certain case that grabbed and really catapulted you, or did people just word of mouth start noticing it? What do you think? Because there's a lot of true crime podcasts out there, and yours has certainly met with a lot of success. What is it you think that did that?
I think, well, when we first started, we thought our dad would listen to it, and that was it. We were like, whatever.
It's a good way to start.
Yeah, exactly. And he did. He listened to every single one of them. But
which got us in trouble because sometimes we would say things, and our dad would be like, I heard what you said on the podcast about me. You can't talk about it.
like,
These little
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that kind of got us. But it kind of started slowly going, and I think once we started doing weekly episodes, because when we first started, our goal was to do weekly, and then it was a lot of work, and we both had full-time jobs and all the things, so we spread it out a little bit more. And then when we got back on that every single week schedule, kind of figured out our groove, it just gradually, we've never marketed it.
Really, it's just word of mouth.
Yes.
People started discovering it. It was there with the others, and they're like, well, I'll check out Killer Queens, the name. Who came up with that? Is there a story behind it?
Yes.
I mean,
I love Queen.
I was
the
about
band.
to say, it's the Queen song, right? So Killer
Yes.
Queen.
And it just kind of fit with what we're talking
Sure.
about. And so, I don't know. That's how it came about.
And with true crime, by the way, and as I was scrolling through, most of the cases you deal with are murder or missing persons cases. Do you ever deal with other types of crime, or is it mostly murder?
No, we have. I mean, we've done some, I say, fun ones. There's one, it was a Netflix docu. Well, it was on Netflix, but it was called Finders Keepers. It was this man who had his leg amputated, and he kept it, taxidermied it, kept it, left it in a storage facility. Then somebody bought the storage facility after he abandoned it. Then there was this fight over who got to keep the leg.
Now
Went to
that's
court, a whole thing,
interesting.
right?
Now that's where do you find these stories sometimes? I mean, some of them, obviously, the high-profile ones, and you've done many of those, are in the news, and we'll talk about it later, but Holly Bobo's one that you've done, and that's something we covered here, Gavel to Gavel. But, for something like that, where do you find the more obscure ones? Is it...
Well, you watched the documentary, didn't you?
Okay,
Yeah,
you
I
just came
saw the
across
documentary.
I didn't know that was out there.
I don't think it's on Netflix anymore,
It's
but
on.
if you can find it somewhere, it's a phenomenal
It's very
watch.
good, yes.
Because, they're fighting over leg. But
There's a lot to play around with
yeah,
that
there's
one,
a lot. But we've been really, we've been blessed with a really engaged listener base. So
they feed you ideas.
They
Oh,
do.
yes.
We started getting messages, like when we, started getting more listeners, and they say, oh, this happened in my hometown, you should cover it. And so I would try to write them down, keep them documented somewhere, and then I made just like a Google form, and we started listing that on the episodes. Hey, we've got a submission form if you want to use it, and we've got 2,600 cases sitting on it right now.
Just right now, and they're from, as you said, all across the country?
all across the world.
And even across the world that you'll research. In your research on these, obviously these days you can Google and punch in and a lot of information, Wikipedia and all that. Do you ever, maybe if there's something you can't find, try to reach out on your own to maybe local law enforcement to just ask a few questions, or call the DA's office and say, hey, we do this podcast, I have a question about this. I don't know, do you ever do that directly if there's something that you can't find online?
I have sometimes, or like investigative journalists, I'll try to reach out to them if I know they covered a case or things like that. A lot of it though, you can find so many court documents online now.
So you
too.
guys know how to go about grabbing the court documents and go through those
there's a lot
yourself.
out there.
Oh, there's no kidding. I mean, the access to it and knowing where to look and to go over them and all the details.
Yeah, I know. It's like when we covered Purvis Payne.
Yeah.
So I did talk to. Are you familiar with Purvis Payne? His case happened in Memphis. He's been
It rings a bell.
convicted of murder in the 80s. There's a lot of thought that it's a wrongful conviction.
Okay.
So his attorney, Kelly Henry, she's Nashville-based. I reached out to her because we were going to cover the case because he was coming up for a hearing that would get him off death row. He has an intellectual disability. She's been fighting to get him off death row. All these things. So we wanted to cover it before that happened. So I had a call with her, and she was so gracious to go over things with me. And I had all the court documents printed. I had hundreds of pages of court documents that I had gone through, and I was writing notes on the side, what in the world is happening here? And I would ask her about stuff, and she was really awesome to share as much as she could.
And she, of course, would like to get that information out so that maybe so some of the cases you do, not only, can that maybe help at least raise some of the questions about his mental competency, but maybe unsolved cases. We'll talk about the Jennifer Wicks case, as we do things online. It could produce new leads.
Absolutely.
For investigation.
And that is one of the goals for the podcast, which I don't think that my thought when we first started it wasn't, I didn't realize that we could be, because we didn't think that we were going to be anywhere near as big, thankfully, that we are, but we didn't realize, or I didn't realize, that our voices could have such an impact
yeah.
of like getting a story out like it is. So we're
now
hoping.
you guys, where you're at, you know, and I deal with some of this myself, not only here at News Channel 5, but through my Facebook page and stuff. You have power now to make a difference. I mean, beyond. I mean, you really do. It's not just, and for a lot of folks, it's very serious stuff, but it's entertainment, it's interesting.
Yes.
But you really have power now.
Yeah.
With that reach, I mean, someone somewhere could see something that produces a tip that solves a case.
Exactly.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, and as many people that are interested in true crime, like you said, you know, a lot of people use it as entertainment. They're watching shows, they're listening to these podcasts, but if every single person who's obsessed with true crime did one thing in the true crime community, donated it in the backlog, or volunteer, you know, or called in something that they, you know, saw or whatever, like, what could we do?
Oh.
You know?
To make a difference.
Yeah.
You know, people out there know things, and
Yes.
they just need to report. Listen, we'll take a break. When we come back, I want to talk more, just a little bit about the fascination with true crime. We can take a phone call or two if you'd like. We're also streaming live on Facebook. If some of you are watching and you're familiar with the Killer Queens podcast and have a question for the two, your chance to ask it, and I'll share that. Also, we'll get, when we come back, a little bit of background. You know, I've got a degree in journalism, went through school, and I'm on TV doing this. We're going to get your background, because you basically do a lot of what I do, and you do it really well. So we'll take a break and be back with more right after this.